G'day, welcome back. So it's fun with table bases today. It's not a very catchy title actually, because everybody knows table bases are just these big databases where endgame positions have been solved up to 7 pieces, and they're not very exciting, but they're very technically very interesting. Now I've already covered these before when I particularly looked at the syzygy databases, where I'll see if I can include a link in the description, where you download the source code from GitHub and you build the code, and then you can run the code and build your own table base 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to 7-piece table bases. Now I've done that, and I've actually built my own table bases up to 6 pieces. And then, of course, the other way of doing it, you go to Lichess, you can actually download the table bases, which I've also done. Right, so there's 2 ways of getting the table bases, and then the main purpose of table bases, I'll just show you quickly the main operation here. Let's just load up the capture screen. So here I have a typical position on the board, and if you run this in your engine, well, let's have a look how you set your engine up. You go in analysis engines and you go into settings, and you can see you put right here, you put the syzygy path in, which is knows where the database is. And then when you do your typical analysis, you can see you got table base hits 4, right? So it hits table base, knows the solution without having to do the calculation. Now that it improves the strength of the engine a little bit, but it's also good because you know the actual best sort of solution. Now, just to what the table bases look like, I'll just quickly fire up here. This is basically, you end up with a directory full of all the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is 5-piece table base, all the possible combinations of 2 kings and then pieces. So 5 pieces means 5-piece table base means 2 kings and 3 other pieces. There's the pawnless ones and the pawn full ones, and you have them there so that when your engine's working, it just sees that file there, files there, it goes, looks at it, and it knows the answer, right? If there's 2 bits, the answer. One is the result, Windross law, and the other bit of the answer is is how long it takes. Okay, fine. So that's kind of what sort of the background on table bases. I'll just load up the other thing I have used them for. Just give me 1 second down here. Yeah, this simulator. I've shown you a few times. Basically, the simulator uses Pygame, and it generates the graphic using Python chess, and it just feeds this position in, depending on where the rook is. This is the Lucina position. White rook's there. The green squares tell you where, if the black rook on those squares, then with black to move, this is a win for white, and I can change the result to draw. So the only drawing positions for black is, it's quite unusual, isn't it? Basically, he has to be able to take the white rook, and then presumably, given the position of the kings, white can force black to sacrifice his rook for the pawn. So that's using the databases in a slightly more systematic way, because obviously it actually feeds all 64 rook positions in and just tells you what the result is, right? So that's kind of the way you can use table bases. So let me close that down. Now, the other way I've heard people use table bases, which is the fun bit of it, is, finding your own chess studies, in a sense, right? Basically searching the table bases and finding interesting positions, and that's what we're going to do today. Just hopefully something which you might find interesting too, and something you might want to try yourself. So how would you go about doing that? I mean, my thought process here is you take a certain material balance. In fact, I'm going to do 2 today. I'm going to do 2 kings and 2 pawns, and 2 kings and 3 pawns, and just feed all the possibilities into the table base, and then come back with some metric which you think is interesting. In this case, it's just going to be the longest mate or the longest step to 0. So basically, I'm just going to say, search these table bases for that material balance. What's the longest solution, and have a look at it and see if they're interesting, right? That's one. There are really other ways of looking at it, but that's sort of the most straightforward way of looking at it. So what we actually do is, let me run, see if this thing runs. That gives you a sense of what's going on, right? Basically, you can see that placing the king on the board, placing the white king on the board, the black king on the board, black pawn and a white pawn, and just iterating over all the possibilities. And then for each of those possibilities, then you do a probe into the table base, tells you this is a win, a draw, or loss, and how long it takes to get to that win, draw, loss. And basically, I'm just storing those results. So that's the way it works. And in fact, we can have a quick look at the code. Don't write Python code like this. I just do this really quickly. It's really, really horrible. Nobody would write it like this. So you can see I'm including all the stuff I need. This is Python chess, the syzygy pro bit, the PGNs, SVGs, and then we need a bit of maths. And this is SVG there. And what we actually do is basically construct a string like this: 2 kings, 2 pawns, and then I've got another one which does 2 kings and 3 pawns. And then, as I say, this is not Python, this is not me, but put one piece on the board, put another piece on the board, put another piece on the board, put another piece on the board. So you're putting 4 pieces on the board, and then first of all, it's got to be a legal position. And if it is a legal position, then you probe the syzygy database. I look at the depth to 0, basically another measurement of depth to mate. And then if it's interesting, if it's more than 13 moves, this is on the 4-piece, 2 kings, 2 pawns, then I'll just save it and I'll have a look at it later. And then you take the pieces off the board and then you do the next one. Really, really horrible code, but actually it worked. It worked for my purposes. So let's have a look at that. Where's that? And then, for instance, what you actually get out for this one is it will tell you. Okay, and here we are. This is sort of the results we get. So 19 moves. I believe this is black to wing, and you can see these positions. We'll look at them on the skid board a little bit later. All have one theme. You've got the defender's pawn on the 3rd or the 6th rank, so that if the attacking king captures the pawn, then it's a win, either side to move. And then in all these positions, the attacking king is able to get on the critical squares of the pawn, and therefore that'll be the key squares of the position and a win. And you can see 19 moves. These are all 19 moves, 19, 19, 19. There might be some other ones, right? So we'll look at one of those positions, one of the most interesting ones, right? So that's sort of what got spat out, and then this cat solution. And then I do it for the 5-piece one. So 2 kings and 3 pawns, and what's the longest depth to mate and so on. And it's something very funny happened here. You can see there's a 103 move depth to 0. We'll have a look at that in a second. And what's going on there, and the more normal solution is about 39 and 41 moves. That's the summary of the situation. 41 moves to win 4 times occurs in the whole tablebase. So it took a few hours to run that, by the way, on the 5-piece. 4-piece runs pretty quickly. So, right, now I've found my positions, and I've loaded up in Skid versus PC. So let's go and have a look at them. Put in my database here. So this is the longest winning position in the 4-piece table base. 21 moves. Let's have a look at what we've just said, right? This pawn is going to be captured by the white king, and what shall we call them? The critical squares there, and if the white king can get under those squares, he'll be able to take the pawn and win the game. And the continuation to win, let's just have a look what it is. So just take the opposition. Oh, right, okay, there we go. I've loaded up. So, isn't it funny? We've got our corresponding squares already, right? So if it was a black to move, he could draw, but it's white to move, and now you can see the continuation that white maintains your position, and then now gets on the key square, and you can imagine that he will win from there. Okay, so that is the longest line in the 4-piece table base. And there's another one which is 19 moves, and you can see the same idea, just white's going to move to G5, and that will be a win. Now, of course, what this hasn't given me in the 4-piece table is it hasn't given me the reti chasing 2 rabbits. So in terms of, like, if you really want to create puzzles, you're going to have to be looking for some other metric, some other sort of whole thing about the 2 rabbits one is it's very artistic, and it's you'd have to think of some other way of telling the computer something's artistic and something is very banal, like this one, very straightforward, all the same sort of metric. This one is a couple of moves shorter, just because the starting position, the kings are on the G file. Now you notice that it's putting the pawns on the B or the G file all the time, because if they're on A or the H, it wouldn't be a win, and if you move them further across, well, then the king maneuver would be shorter and it would be less moves to win. Okay, cool. So that was the 4-piece table base. So let's move on to the 5-piece table base, and you can see we've got we're going to look at three positions here. The first one is absolutely bonkers. So this, I actually loaded it into syzygy. Let's see if it's still there. Right, you can see that. It says depth 0, 103, which is what I got. Depth to mate 193. So all these positions devolve into the same. There's a bunch of them. There's hundreds of them, right? But let's just go through the line, which is like king b8 or king b7. Oh, okay, I've got a line there. Move king e6. That's a bit like the ready study. So we have this position, and it's a knight pawn on the 5th rank, and both sides have queens. This is the position which is apparently 190. That'll be a bit less than 193, and unfortunately it's a cursed win, because there's going to be 192 moves. Within that, there's going to be 100 moves without a pawn move. Now this deserves a video of all itself, which I'm not going to do now. hour. It is quite fascinating, and I was just looking into this. I don't know if there's any theory behind it, but I found this little comment here. This is queen and pawn versus queen on with the Wikipedia. John Nunn wrote 3 books based on the most important endgames in the 5-piece endgame table. So he's done this 20 years ago. We're just following in the great man's episodes, but admitted this endgame because it proved too hard to understand. He also commented, this is the trickiest of all 5-man endings, which is unfortunate as is one of the most common to arise in practice, which is very true. I mean, obviously, book and pawn is probably more common, but you end up with a lot of these. And in fact, when I was doing my sort of blunder analysis, there are a lot of positions, not this one in particular, where supposedly lots of GMs would give away wins and draws by blundering in variants of this queen plus pawn versus queen endgame. Anyway, so that's quite interesting. As I say, I might do a video on that one, but that's not what we're going to look at today because that is way too complicated. So what I'm going to do now is look at 2 positions which I found from doing this little study. One is 41 moves, the other one is 37. So let's load this one. I'll save that. Okay, now this looks very familiar. This is indeed very familiar to one of the Grigoriev studies, and the solution is exactly the same. If you remember correctly, this structure, this pawn structure with the passed pawn. The point about this is that you've got a square, and that restricts where the black king can move to. And then, so we just follow the winning strategy here. It's exactly the same as the Grigoriev study, but he did it 100 years ago without a computer, right? And then now black cannot go outside the square. Remember, exactly the same thing. So he keeps diagonal opposition, and now we run down the side, and he can't go outside. And then now obviously we're going to be able to win this because you look at this, now we go all the way around the other side, and he just can't stop us from pushing. Now we're going to push the pawn and take the other pawn and win. Okay, so that is a very long sequence. So it really is true. That's like 20, maybe in 40. Yeah, we can continue. I'm very impressed with that. So get back to starting position. So the computers found this Grigoriev technique where our rook gets there and back to there, and then we find ourselves all the way across there. Right? Amazing. Anyway, that's good. So if Grigoriev hadn't done it by hand 100 years ago, this would be a very good study. Okay, and then the next one we're going to look at is also, it's equally fascinating. It's a different structure. Let's load it up, save that. So this is the other pawn structure we saw a lot in the Spielman ones, and also we saw in the Grigoriev ones. People did this structure where I called it like the depressed triangle, where that pawn is not passed, and you've got to do a lot more hard work to win the game. And in this case, it is corresponding squares. I'm not going to go through all of them. I spent a bit of time coding it up. So the idea is, let me just, I think it's 1 square forward. Okay, right. So I think this is correct, right? So what's happened is you got these banks of key squares on both sides, right? If white ever got that pawn, he's winning. And then so corresponding squares 1 and 2, black has to be there. 3 and 4, black has to be there. It could be there as well, but just for purposes. And then the shortest route, 5-5 has to have the opposition at the opposition, and then you run from one side to the other. So that's the sort of layout. We've seen that before in those other Grigoriev studies. I think it was from the 1920s, where this pawn structure was sort of back on the second and the third rank, and they were really fascinating. So let's go through. The winning move is to take the opposition. It's the only winning move. And now as we move on, different ways black can play, but let's say he stays on the C file. Only one winning move, keep the opposition. That would be a logical move. Now we take a sort of a diagonal opposition. Now the point about that is that this square is covered by our pawn, so he can't move onto that square. And that's why he's losing out. We're able to move forwards. Let's say he moves to the square C6. Well, we don't go to C3. We take the opposition again. And you can see we just edge our way forwards, taking advantage of the fact that black can't go onto D6. Now we've got much closer. Now, one thing to think about is you think, well, why isn't black wandering over here? And the problem is he has to, when we're here, he has to stay, we're 2 squares away from the square number 8. So he'll have to stay within range of that, right? And he'll stay within range of the 7 squares. So he's doing that. Now we've moved further forwards. Now we're next to 7. We can't move in the 7 square because we'll move in the 7 square. Can't move in the 6 square. We'll move in the 6 square because you look at that. So if he goes there, we'll go there, goes there, we'll go there, goes there, or there, we'll move there, right? So where did he go? He went to the other square, but now he's just, he's beaten because we're just going to dash across. Let's go through that. Doesn't make it in time. He needed one more move. He moves to 2, we move to 2, and we're going to shoulder him back, and we're going to get the pawn. Okay, so that's very interesting. So that's the idea, and that's about mate in 40, right? So that is what you can do with the tablebase. You just put this big generic search in, it'll find these positions, and then we found a couple of quite long-winded corresponding square positions, which kind of was what I was quite expecting to find. I was hoping to find more like Reti type positions, but anyway, corresponding squares, and you can see that you really need to do these long-winded solutions. And what I'll also point out is this. It's amazing that it's this pawn formation, and I go back to the previous one, this pawn formation, that those guys 100 years ago, they knew that there was different variants of corresponding squares coming out of their ears with both of those, which is really amazing. Anyway, I'll stop there. I thought it was a short, fun little video, and I just wanted to highlight another pretty interesting use of table bases, and I think it can really be fun using the table base and coming up with positions you haven't seen before, and then trying to solve them yourself. Okay, great. Hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching.